What is up, guys? Today's video is going to be quite a bit different than what I've been doing recently. I've kind of gotten away from reposting other videos like Douglas Murray, Peter Hitchens, Ben Shapiro, etc. But I came across this the other day. It was only at like 30,000 views, so I don't think very many people have seen it. It's an absolutely great video. You should definitely check it out. I couldn't do a better job. Obviously, Douglas Murray is a super bright guy, and he explains it perfectly in my opinion. Anyways, this is Douglas Murray versus Chandry, which, if you don't know, is a Muslim guy who's been recently convicted of promoting terrorism, more or less. So let me know what you guys think about this video. I will see you in the next one.
Hello, I'm Ian Collins and welcome to the Express Debate. The issue is British jihadists. Should those who've left this country to go and fight in other places such as Syria ever be allowed to return? With us to discuss this is the writer Douglas Murray and also Chandry. Douglas, if we can start with you, what are your thoughts on people being allowed to come back to the UK if they've previously left this country to fight elsewhere?
Well, it's undesirable that they return, of course. A lot of them will be killed on the battlefield, a lot of them will be killed by other Islamic groups, a lot of them will be spoken to in languages they don't understand, including Arabic, and will be machine gunned against a wall in a conflict they don't really understand. It's much better if people don't return having been involved and wanted to be involved in a conflict like that. So
the government should actively stop people returning who've been to Syria?
Well, if there are people who they can't stop returning, who, as it were, end up at the borders, the UK borders, then they should, of course, be taken in, questioned where relevant, charged and prosecuted.
And Chandry, that's reasonable, isn't it? Somebody's left this country to go and fight in a war, possibly a war against this very country. It's reasonable that the government wouldn't want to, or somebody wouldn't want to allow them to come back in.
Well, I would say from a purely criminal perspective, the burden of proof in the rest of the criminal law is to have sufficient evidence to substantiate a charge. So if these guys have actually not committed any crime in England, then why are we stopping them returning? I think this is the first point. Secondly, the empirical evidence doesn't lend itself to the fact that people are actually returning to target Britain. And I think it's very foolish to suppose that if the government have this policy, then people are actually going to go abroad and think, well, I'm going to come back with my British passport. You know, if they're going to come back, they're going to probably have another passport, or they're simply going to say, well, why risk losing my passport? I can do a kind of a Lee Rigby type scenario in this country. I think it's a very ill thought out policy. I don't think it will work. I think it will disenfranchise the Muslim community here. I think it would be a cause of further radicalisation in this country. And I think really you're pushing people into the arms of the Islamic State, because if people do go abroad and they think about returning, they're probably going to think, well, I may as well stay here because I'm not wanted really in England. I'm being treated, as a second-class citizen.
It's very likely, as you well know as well, from your own history, that people who are involved in this sort of thing, get involved in a conflict like this, are disproportionately likely, if they return, to be involved in groups and engaged in acts of terrorism themselves. You know, because so many members of your own group have been convicted for acts of terrorism.
What I would say to you is, for the rest of the world, 2,000 people being murdered in Palestine is terrorism, and yet people from this country, Jews who go to Israel, who fight with the Israeli Defense Force, are not having their passports taken away. This is only applying to the Muslim community. There is no evidence whatsoever to substantiate any charge against someone who's travelled to Syria to defend his brothers and sisters, whom your government may say is a terrorist, to withdraw their own passports.
Can I just ask, why do you think a Brit goes to Syria? What do you think their specific purpose is?
Well, I mean, I know why. I mean, before June, I believe the 29th, people were going there to fight against Bashar al-Assad. And by the way, William Hague and Cameron said, this regime needs to be removed. They were supporting people militarily, logistically, the Free Syrian Army. And, it's quite ironic that if people, responded to that drumroll call of support for the resistance, they were being tarnished as terrorists. So why is it, on the one hand, that you're saying that people should go and remove a regime?
But the Prime Minister didn't encourage people to go, did he?
Well, no, he didn't say
it's fine to go and fight.
In all intents and respects, he was saying that Bashar al-Assad needs to be removed. And they were supporting logistically and by propaganda.
But is that the role of young British Muslims then to go and carry out?
But then if your own citizens respond to your Prime Minister, for example, and go abroad and say, well, actually, this is...
So you think British Muslims are responding to David Cameron?
I'm putting the scenario to that. If people did respond to that drumroll call of support to remove Bashar al-Assad, why are they now being treated as terrorists? You cannot have it both ways. You cannot say we need to remove the regime and support people militarily. And when your own citizens go and say, well, actually, I'm going to do the same thing, then say, well, actually, we're going to take your passport away.
Douglas, is there a conflicting message here on the back of what Anjem has just said?
The British government is a democratic government, and it represents in the interests of the people's country, and obviously that's not always clear, and sometimes democratic countries change their policies and things, and sometimes they change their interests. That's the nature of non-autocratic, non-dictatorial countries, that their politics shift. But I'm very interested in this point that Anjan doesn't want to admit what ISIS are doing. Anyone can go online and see the beheadings, the appalling slaughter of Yazidis, Christians and others that's going on all the time under ISIS's control. But what I'm interested in is, Anjan, you admit that the punishment for instance, apostasy under the perfect Islamic state that you think that ISIS is creating is death, is murder, execution, capital punishment, you call it. But you say that ISIS isn't carrying it out. So what is it? Are they just not very good?
Can I ask you something, Douglas? Can I ask you one question? One question. I mean, because you had a lot of grey areas before. You obviously know the name of James, Foley, and you know the names of Sokolov, etc. Can you name me one of the women and children who've been slaughtered by the drones and the bombing campaign recently by the Americans and British? Well, I mean, they've had drone attacks and they've had aerial campaigns. We know, by all accounts, dozens of women and children being slaughtered. You know,
against ISIS. Do you know, they're against ISIS.
But they're not. But you know, ISIS aren't women and children, are they? I mean, let's admit it. There are women and children who've been killed. Do we know the names of any of those? We don't, do we? We're not interested, are we?
I'm not interested in
You're not interested
in naming the names, no.
Well, this is the problem, isn't it?
It is inevitable, as you well know, that in a conflict like that, there will be people killed. And the aim is to push back ISIS, precisely, incidentally, and precisely in order to try to stop Iraq and Syria being dictated to or governed by people like your friends in ISIS, because the people who are the first victims of this in both of these countries are Muslims. They're Muslims that you probably don't think are proper Muslims. They're Muslims of the kind that you would think in a perfect Islamic state could be killed. So don't pose as a defender of the citizens of Syria and Iraq, when the thing you would wish to impose on those citizens is the most barbaric, the most fundamentalist and authoritarian form of government that the world could ever see.
Just a final point, Anjem, firstly, to bring it back to where we started. If we look at Brits that have gone to Syria, do you think it's right, if there is the evidence there then, that they are charged in this country under the full weight of British law? Are you saying there's something wrong with that?
Essentially, I don't accept the British law anyway. I mean, if you have a law, then you need to apply it universally to all people. The fact is that these laws are only being applied against Muslims. This has purely been hyped up in order to bring in more draconian laws in this country to support the bombing campaign that is taking place in Iraq and Syria, and basically to give some kind of credence to Cameron to say, well, actually he's anti-terrorism and pro-democracy.
Okay.
And, he thinks it's working.
And Douglas, your thoughts on what should happen at the point of somebody coming back from somewhere such as Syria? What should the authorities be doing?
The status quo is pretty much working, which is that if people do come back, they can be charged. There are many laws and the terrorism acts under which they can be charged. I think the thing that you really have to reflect on this is that Anjem has his own reasons for trying to pretend that there isn't a conveyor belt problem in this area, and for pretending that people are going to return from Syria and chopping off people's heads and massacring women and children. He's hoping that they will that he can persuade us that they will return to this country and become nice liberal Democrats of some kind. And he knows very well that isn't true. The reason he knows it isn't true is because so many people who've been members of his group, in fact, more members of that group have been banned than any other group of terrorists in the UK, including Al-Qaeda. Membership of al-Mujahideen, more common among convicted terrorists, even the membership of Al-Qaeda. Anjem knows that issue. He knows the number of people. He knows the names of the individuals, because he sat down with them for years. The people who do things like behead Lee Rigby in South London. The sort of people who, as his friend the other month, who went out from Crawley and carried out a truck bombing in Syria. These are the people. He knows this. He knows that pattern. They get taught these horrible, radical ideas that most Muslims completely reject. They get taught them here, and they carry out acts of violence. It's a conveyor belt. It's what they want.
OK, we are out of time, gentlemen. That's it for this particular discussion. Join us again soon for the next Express Debate.